In a locked government archive, there's a document so damning, it stayed classified for over 20 years. It doesn't describe a war. It doesn't describe a natural disaster. It describes the deliberate silence of a government, while an estimated 30 million of its own people starve to death. No press coverage, no foreign aid requests, no admission, just silence, and a lie so total that even today, most people have never heard what really happened in rural China between 1959 and 1961. How does a government hide the deaths of tens of millions of people? Not for a year, not for 5 years, for decades. Who decided that silence was worth more than the truth? And what happens to a nation that builds its future on top of a lie that big? This is the story of the Great Chinese Famine, officially blamed on bad weather, but built instead on impossible grain quotas, punished dissent, and a leadership that refused to admit failure, even as entire villages disappeared. Local officials falsified harvest numbers to please Beijing. Grain was exported while people ate bark, leaves, and eventually worse. Anyone who spoke up was labeled an enemy of the state. By the time the truth started leaking out, the men responsible were already rewriting the history books. So how did this happen? And how did it stay buried for so long? To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the man who made it possible. Mao Zedong had spent decades fighting for control of China, and by 1958, he wanted proof that his vision of communism could outperform the West. He called it the Great Leap Forward. The plan was simple on paper: transform China from a farming nation into an industrial superpower in just a few years. In reality, it meant tearing apart the way hundreds of millions of people lived almost overnight. Private farms were dissolved. Families were folded into massive collective communes where meals were eaten together, tools were shared, and every decision came from the top down. Farmers who had grown food for their own households for generations were suddenly told what to plant, how much to grow, and where it would go. Local Communist Party officials were handed impossible production targets, numbers dreamed up in Beijing with little connection to what the land could actually produce. But admitting a shortfall wasn't an option. Careers, and sometimes lives, depended on hitting the quota. So officials did what desperate people under pressure often do. They lied. Harvest numbers were inflated, sometimes by 2 or 3 times the real amount. On paper, China's grain output was skyrocketing. In the fields, the truth was the opposite. At the same time, Mao pushed an equally reckless plan to boost steel production, ordering villagers to melt down pots, tools, and even farm equipment in crude backyard furnaces. The steel that came out was often useless, too brittle to build anything, but the campaign pulled millions of farmers away from the fields during planting and harvest season, at the exact moment their labor was needed most. Grain that should have fed local villages was instead shipped to cities and, in a decision that would later be seen as one of the greatest failures in modern history, exported overseas to maintain the appearance of prosperity and to repay foreign debts. Officials in Beijing believed the inflated harvest reports, or chose to, and set export and procurement targets based on numbers that didn't exist. Villages were left with less food than they needed to survive the winter, even as reports claimed record surpluses. By late 1958, the warning signs were already there. Local cadres who dared to report real numbers were denounced as defeatists, or worse, as class enemies working against the revolution. Silence became the safest option. Then, in the summer of 1959, one man tried to break that silence. Marshal Peng Dehuai, a decorated military leader and one of the most respected men in the Communist Party, had traveled through the countryside and seen the devastation firsthand. Starving villages, empty granaries, children too weak to stand. At a party conference in the mountain town of Lushan, he wrote a private letter to Mao, carefully worded, respectful in tone, laying out the truth about what the Great Leap Forward was actually doing to the people. It should have started a conversation. Instead, it triggered a purge. Mao treated the letter as a personal attack and a threat to his authority. Peng was denounced, stripped of his position, and labeled an enemy of the party. The message to every other official in the room was unmistakable: tell the truth, and your career, your freedom, and possibly your life will be the price. After Lushan, any remaining resistance to the Great Leap Forward's false narrative collapsed. The lie was no longer just tolerated, it was mandatory. To the outside world, none of this existed. Foreign journalists were shown model communes, stocked with food and smiling workers, carefully staged for the cameras, before being quietly dismantled once the visitors left. Party propaganda continued to describe record harvests and a thriving socialist utopia, publishing photographs of grain piled so high that children could stand on top of it and wave. Images later revealed to have been staged using boards hidden underneath the crop to fake the volume. Inside China, the communal dining halls that had once symbolized shared abundance became empty shells, their pots requisitioned for the failed steel campaign, their grain stores long since emptied. In some regions, local officials facing impossible quotas resorted to violence to extract non-existent surplus grain from villagers who had none left to give. Reports that would only surface years later described beatings, forced labor, and starvation used as a tool of control against anyone suspected of hoarding food. And still, at the top, the official story never changed. The famine, when it was acknowledged internally at all, was blamed on unusually severe natural disasters, on flooding and drought, rather than on policy. That framing would go on to shape the official record for decades. By 1959, the crisis had stopped being a policy failure and had become something closer to a slow-motion catastrophe, unfolding province by province, while Beijing insisted everything was under control. Nowhere was it worse than Xinyang, a farming region in Henan province that had once been known for its rice paddies and reliable harvests. Local officials there had reported some of the most inflated numbers in the entire country, desperate to please Beijing and terrified after watching what happened to Peng Dehuai. When the promised grain failed to appear, those same officials refused to admit the numbers had been fabricated. Instead, they accused villagers of hiding food. Grain requisition teams went door to door, searching homes, digging up floors, and confiscating anything edible, even seed grain that had been set aside for the next planting season. Anyone caught concealing food, or simply suspected of it, could be beaten, imprisoned, or worse. In Xinyang alone, later investigations would estimate that over 1 million people died in a matter of months, not from drought, but from a famine caused directly by policy and enforced by local terror. Roads out of the region were blocked. Officials were ordered to prevent starving villagers from fleeing to areas where food might still exist, out of fear that refugees would expose what was happening. Letters describing the crisis, when they were written at all, were intercepted before they reached Beijing. Provincial leaders who tried to raise concerns through official channels were reassigned, demoted, or silenced. Meanwhile, in Sichuan province, one of China's most productive agricultural regions, Party Secretary Li Jingchuan pushed procurement quotas even higher than the national average, determined to prove his province's loyalty. Some estimates suggest Sichuan alone lost more people to the famine than any other province in China. Across the country, survivors would later describe stripping bark from trees, grinding corn cobs into edible paste, and eating a fine white clay that filled the stomach but caused fatal digestive blockages. In the most desperate regions, extreme accounts of survival cannibalism were later documented by researchers and in leaked internal party records, details so harrowing that officials worked for decades to keep them out of any public record. Through it all, grain requisition quotas from Beijing did not slow down. In fact, in several provinces, they increased in 1960, even as death tolls climbed and local granaries sat completely empty. The system built to prevent officials from reporting bad news had worked exactly as designed. It had simply designed itself into a catastrophe that Beijing could not see or refuse to. Doctors in rural clinics, where clinics still existed at all, were instructed to record cause of death using vague terms like edema or illness, never starvation, and never as a consequence of grain policy. Death registries in some counties simply stopped being updated, either because there were too many bodies to record, or because local officials understood that an accurate count would be its own kind of confession. Village leaders who buried the dead quietly and kept working the fields were rewarded with praise for stability. Those who reported the true scale of the crisis, even privately, risked being labeled as spreading rumors that undermined the party, a charge that could end a career or a life. By the winter of 1960, entire villages across Henan, Sichuan, Anhui, and Gansu had been reduced to a fraction of their population, their fields lying fallow, not from lack of will, but because there was no longer anyone left with the strength to work them. And in Beijing, the official newspapers continued to print stories of a nation marching confidently towards socialist prosperity. By 1961, the scale of the disaster had become impossible to fully hide, even inside the party's own leadership. Grain production had collapsed so severely that China, once a net exporter of food, was quietly forced to begin importing grain from Canada and Australia, a stunning reversal that party propaganda never fully explained to the public. Behind closed doors, more pragmatic leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping began pushing to roll back the most extreme Great Leap policies. Communes were scaled down. Farmers were quietly allowed to cultivate small private plots again, a policy that had been condemned as counter-revolutionary just 2 years earlier. In January 1962, the party convened what became known as the 7,000 Cadres Conference, gathering officials from across the country to assess what had gone wrong. For the first time, some leaders spoke, carefully, about the failures of the Great Leap Forward, though few dared attach Mao's name directly to the disaster. Liu Shaoqi went further than most, reportedly telling the assembly that the crisis was partly the result of human error, not just natural disaster, a striking break from the official line. Mao, sensing the shift in mood, offered a limited self-criticism and stepped back from day-to-day economic policy, allowing Liu and Deng to steer the country toward recovery. But the retreat was tactical, not remorseful. Mao never accepted responsibility for the death toll, and the party never issued a full public accounting of how many people had died or why. Internal estimates varied wildly, and for decades, the true number remained a closely guarded secret, debated only by demographers working with incomplete and often deliberately distorted records. Farmers slowly returned to something resembling normal agricultural life, and by the mid-1960s, harvests had recovered. But Mao had not forgotten who had challenged him, or who had benefited politically from his humiliation at the 7,000 Cadres Conference. That resentment would not stay buried for long. Within a few years, it would resurface as one of the most destructive political campaigns in modern Chinese history, and Liu Shaoqi himself would pay the ultimate price for having spoken the truth. For the villages that had endured the worst of the famine, recovery was slow and uneven. Entire family lines had been wiped out. Some counties would not return to their pre-famine population for another generation. Yet even as life stabilized, the subject remained almost impossible to discuss openly. Local archives were sealed. Survivors learned quickly that describing what they had lived through, even decades later, could still draw suspicion from local authorities eager to protect the official narrative of natural disaster. A national tragedy had been folded quietly into the past, acknowledged just enough internally to allow policy to change, but never enough to let the full truth reach the Chinese public, let alone the rest of the world. Here's where the story takes its sharpest turn, because the truth about the famine wasn't uncovered through a whistleblower, or a leaked confession, or a foreign spy. It was uncovered through math. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, after Mao's death, China began cautiously releasing census and demographic data as part of a broader opening to the outside world. Foreign demographers and economists, expecting to see steady population growth through the late 1950s and early 1960s, instead found a statistical anomaly that made no sense. Population numbers for 1960 didn't just slow down, they collapsed. Birth rates cratered. Death rates spiked to levels that, in peacetime, simply shouldn't have been possible. Researchers like Judith Bannister, and later the Chinese journalist Yang Jisheng, began cross-referencing county-level records, grain procurement archives, and internal party documents that had never been meant for public eyes. What they found was staggering. Depending on the methodology, estimates for excess deaths during the famine ranged from roughly 15 million to as high as 45 million people, with many serious historians converging somewhere around 30 million, making it very likely the deadliest famine in human history, deadlier than any war China fought in the 20th century. And here's the twist within the twist. The Chinese government never announced this number. It was never taught in schools. It was reconstructed entirely from the outside, using the party's own bureaucratic paperwork against the official story it had spent decades protecting. Young Jisheng, who lost his own father to starvation during the famine as a teenager, spent over a decade secretly gathering internal provincial archives before publishing his findings in a book called Tombstone. The book was immediately banned in mainland China. Yang was placed under surveillance. To this day, Tombstone remains blocked, and any classroom mention of the famine in China still typically defaults to the phrase, 3 years of natural disasters, the exact same cover story invented by local officials back in 1959, still repeated as fact more than 60 years later. Even more unsettling is what happened to the raw data itself. Many of the county-level archives that demographers relied on were only accessible for a brief window in the 1980s, before local officials, sensing the political risk, began restricting access again. Some researchers who traveled to rural archives in the 2000s to verify earlier findings reported that entire collections of grain and mortality records had since become unavailable, officially due to reorganization, with no clear timeline for when or if they would reopen. The very evidence that exposed the cover-up was, itself, being quietly recovered, which raises an uncomfortable question this documentary can't fully answer. How much of the true story still remains locked away, and how close did we come to never uncovering any of it at all? But the final twist in this story isn't just that the numbers were hidden, it's who was never held accountable for them. Li Jingchuan, the party secretary who pushed Sichuan's quotas to some of the highest levels in the country, presiding over a province that may have lost more people than any other, was not punished. He was promoted, continuing his career within the Communist Party for years afterward. Many local officials who falsified reports, seized seed grain, or ordered violent crackdowns during the famine went on to hold positions of power for the rest of their lives, their roles in the disaster never publicly examined. And Mao himself, the man whose policies triggered the deadliest famine in recorded history, was never formally condemned by the party he built. In 1981, the Communist Party did issue an official historical resolution acknowledging that mistakes were made during the Great Leap Forward. But it carefully avoided attaching a death toll, avoided naming individuals, and ultimately concluded that Mao's overall legacy was, in the party's own words, 70% correct and 30% mistaken, a verdict that remains the official position to this day. His portrait still hangs over Tiananmen Square. His face is still on every denomination of Chinese currency. The man responsible for tens of millions of deaths was not erased from history. He was rounded, mathematically, into a net positive. For a country of over 1 billion people, that 70-30 verdict became the ceiling on the conversation. Not the floor for a deeper reckoning, but the final word, closing the door on any further public accounting before it could really open. Decades later, the true number is still debated, the archives are still incomplete, and the official story, China teaches its own citizens, still hasn't caught up to what the rest of the world quietly pieced together. So here's the real question. If a government can hide something this size for this long, what else, right now, might still be sitting in a locked drawer somewhere? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more hidden history like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next.